Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to do a deep dive today on something that I think affects almost all of us, no matter where you live, and that is vacant and abandoned properties.
Oh, yeah.
So, you see them, you drive by them, they're the empty houses, the lots that sometimes get overgrown, just kind of these forgotten spaces. And I've always been curious about, well, a couple things. One, what exactly causes that to happen,
Hmm.
and then also what can be done about it. So today we're going to try and turn eyesores into opportunities. And our main source material is a paper that's called Neighborhood Stabilization, Legal Strategies for Vacant and Abandoned Properties. And it's by Frank Alexander and Leslie Powell. It was actually written back in 2011.
Okay.
But a lot of the insights are surprisingly relevant today.
Yeah, it's interesting because even though it's been over a decade, a lot of these core issues haven't really gone away. So I think we can definitely learn a lot from looking at this research.
Okay, so before we jump into solutions, I think the first thing we got to do is just define the problem a little bit.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of people use the terms vacant and abandoned interchangeably, but I think they're actually two different things, right?
You're absolutely right. There is a distinction between the two. So when we talk about vacant, it simply means that nobody's living there at the moment. That could be a house that's on the market or, a rental property
Hmm.
between tenants. So in those cases, vacancy isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just a temporary state. Abandoned, on the other hand, implies that the owner has essentially walked away. They've stopped paying taxes. They've given up responsibility for the property. So it's really like the difference between pausing a movie and just switching it off completely.
Gotcha. So an abandoned property is kind of like well, I think most people would agree it's a bad thing, but how does one empty house impact an entire neighborhood?
Well, imagine you're thinking about buying a house,
Hmm.
and just down the block you see a property that's boarded up, overgrown. Maybe there's even some graffiti. Is that going to make you feel good about moving into that neighborhood?
Probably not. No.
No, it definitely doesn't send the right message. And the reality is, abandoned properties drag down property values for everyone nearby.
Okay, so it's like a financial hit.
It is. There's a real financial cost. And it's not just about aesthetics. Abandoned properties often become magnets for crime vandalism, even squatters.
Yeah, it's almost like they invite trouble.
They do. And there's actually a study from Chicago back in 2005 that tried to put a dollar amount on the damage caused by these properties. And they found that an abandoned property, even before foreclosure starts, cost the city an average of nearly $20,000.
Wow.
And if there's arson involved, the cost jumps to over $34,000.
It's almost like a hidden tax on the whole neighborhood.
Exactly. It's a burden that everyone has to share. And that's just the financial side of things.
Yeah.
We also have to consider the social and psychological impacts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Abandoned properties create this atmosphere of neglect and decline, and that can really drag down community morale.
It's like that broken window effect, right? One broken window leads to more broken windows. And suddenly the whole neighborhood feels less safe, less inviting.
That's a great analogy. It's like a visual representation of a community that's struggling.
So before we get into solutions, I think it's helpful to understand like what actually leads to a property being abandoned in the first place.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are some of the root causes that that this paper highlights?
Well, one major factor is the mortgage foreclosure crisis. Especially back in the mid-2000s, we saw a huge spike in foreclosures. And a lot of those properties ended up vacant. And eventually some of them transitioned into abandonment.
Yeah, I remember that being a big issue. It was all over the news.
It was a really tough time for a lot of people, and the impact is still being felt in some communities.
So we've got individual circumstances like losing a job or facing foreclosure,
Right.
but then we also have these larger economic forces at play.
Absolutely. Another factor is economic decline in certain areas. Think about towns that were built around industries that have disappeared.
Okay.
The jobs go away, people move out, and properties get left behind. It becomes this vicious cycle.
So what about our legal system? Does this paper point to any ways in which like laws and regulations might actually be contributing to the problem?
Unfortunately, yes. The authors argue that outdated property tax laws and these really clunky foreclosure processes can actually incentivize abandonment.
How so?
Well, in some cases, these foreclosure cases can drag on for years. And while that legal battle is playing out, the property just sits there deteriorating.
That seems counterproductive.
It is. And it's not just the time frame. The sheer complexity of the system is a major issue. Did you know that there are over 150 different property tax systems in the U.S.?
Wow, 150.
150.
That sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
It is incredibly complex and inefficient, so reforming these systems is a major focus of the paper.
Okay, so we've got a problem with kind of a tangled web of causes, but the good news is there are legal strategies that can help, right?
Absolutely. The paper outlines a whole bunch of different approaches, and some cities and states are already putting them into action.
Okay, I'm ready for some solutions. Where do we start?
Well, let's start with property tax foreclosure reform. The goal here is to streamline the process, make it faster and cheaper for cities to take control of abandoned properties.
Okay, so instead of waiting years for things to get sorted out, the city can step in and prevent that decay from spreading.
Exactly. One idea is to shift to what's called in rem foreclosure. So instead of trying to track down the original owner, who might be long gone, the city focuses on just the property itself.
So it's like hitting the reset button on ownership.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So property tax reform can help get these properties back into circulation faster. What else can be done?
Well, stronger code enforcement is another key strategy. It's about dusting off those old housing and building codes, making sure they actually address modern problems, and then having the power to actually enforce them.
So it's not just about having the rules on the books, it's about making sure people actually follow them.
Right. And one way to do that is by hitting negligent owners where it hurts. Their wallets.
Okay.
The paper suggests things like imposing liens on properties that have violations and prioritizing those liens above other claims.
So even if the property's in foreclosure, the city can still take action.
Exactly. It's about sending a clear message that you can't just neglect your property and expect to get away with it.
There are consequences.
There are consequences.
Okay, so what about the situations where the owner is completely MIA?
Ah, yes, the disappearing owner.
Like they've just vanished into thin air.
Well, for those cases, the paper suggests something called receivership actions. It's kind of like when a company goes bankrupt and a court appoints someone to manage its assets and try to get it back on track.
Oh, so it's like a temporary guardian for the property.
That's a great way to think about it. A receiver is appointed, they take control of the property, manage it, potentially rehab it, and ultimately try to sell it to a responsible owner.
That sounds like a pretty powerful tool.
It can be. And the authors suggest expanding who can bring these receivership actions. So potentially empowering community groups or even concerned neighbors to step in.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's about giving the community more agency to address these issues directly.
So is there anything we can do to prevent properties from becoming abandoned in the first place?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. The paper talks about something called vacant property registration. It's a relatively new approach, but over 240 local governments have already adopted some form of it.
Okay, how does that work?
It's pretty straightforward. Basically, owners are required to register any vacant properties with the local government.
Okay.
This gives the city a way to track these properties, identify potential problems early on, and even require owners to take steps to secure and maintain them.
So the city's being proactive.
Exactly.
Instead of waiting for things to go wrong, they're keeping tabs on these vacant properties.
Right. And if owners don't comply or if they let the property deteriorate, they face penalties.
So it's a way to encourage responsible ownership
Exactly.
and hopefully prevent those properties from slipping into abandonment.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about property owners, but what about the banks? The ones holding mortgages on these properties?
Ah, yes, the lenders.
Do they get off scot-free?
Well, not necessarily. The paper discusses some interventions that are specifically targeted at mortgage foreclosure practices.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about that complex web of 150 property tax systems?
Yeah.
Well, it gets even more complicated when you bring in things like the mortgage electronic registration system.
MERS.
MERS, yeah.
Oh, yeah, wasn't that a big deal during the housing crisis?
It was.
Mm.
MERS essentially created this electronic system for tracking mortgages. But it made it really difficult to figure out who actually owned the loan. And this lack of transparency led to all sorts of problems during foreclosures.
So the technology was supposed to make things easier, but it actually made things more complicated.
You could say that. So the paper suggests requiring more transparency in these processes, making it crystal clear who's responsible for maintaining the property during foreclosure.
Oh, okay.
And it even goes a step further by suggesting potential assessments on foreclosure deeds to help cover the cost that local governments have to bear.
So the banks would actually have to contribute to the solution.
Exactly.
I like where this is going.
Yeah, it's about shared responsibility.
All right, so finally we come to what might be the most innovative solution of all.
Yep.
Land banks.
Land banks.
I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not really sure what they are.
So think of them as a sort of second chance for abandoned properties.
Yeah.
They're these public or quasi-public entities that are specifically created to acquire and manage these properties
Hmm.
and breathe new life into them.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how do they actually work? Where do they get all these properties from?
Well, they have a few different avenues. They can get them through tax foreclosures, government liens, direct purchases, or even third-party deposits, where someone basically says, hey, I don't want this property anymore, you take it.
So they're like property rescuers.
Yeah, you could say that. They swoop in and give these forgotten spaces a new purpose.
So what happens to the properties once the land bank gets them?
Well, that's where the real magic happens. Land banks become these active managers. They work to stabilize property values and repurpose the land for the community's benefit. They might rehab the properties, demolish them if necessary, or even assemble parcels for larger redevelopment projects.
So they have a lot of flexibility.
They do. They act as a sort of secondary market for these properties, ensuring that they don't just sit there decaying, but actually contribute to the community's well-being.
Okay, I'm starting to see how land banks can be a real game changer. But I imagine there are challenges too, right? It's not all sunshine and roses.
Oh, you're absolutely right. They're not a magic bullet. And we'll dive into some of those complexities in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so before we move on, what are your thoughts so far? What stood out to you the most from what we've discussed?
You know, I'm really struck by the sheer number of approaches
Yeah.
and the creativity that's involved. It's not just about punishing bad owners. It's about giving communities the tools to be proactive
Mm.
and shape their own destinies.
Yeah, it feels very empowering.
It is empowering.
Okay.
And it all starts with shifting our mindset about land itself. Remember how the paper talked about land not being a disposable consumer good?
Yeah.
That really resonated with me. It's more interconnected, more lasting.
Yeah, if we're going to solve this problem of abandoned properties, maybe that whole mindset of land as just another commodity needs an update. All right, so in part two, we're going to explore that idea further. How do we shift our thinking to see land as something we're all responsible for, something that requires stewardship? Stay tuned.
Welcome back. So, we just finished talking about land banks as this potential solution for abandoned properties, but at the end of the last part, you brought up this idea from the research paper about shifting our mindset towards land, not treating it as just another disposable thing.
Right, the authors Alexander and Powell, they really emphasize that point. It's about recognizing that land is deeply interconnected with our lives, our communities, our future. It's not like that old phone you toss in a drawer and forget about.
It's more like the foundation of our homes, our neighborhoods, our entire society.
Exactly. And the decisions we make about land today have ripple effects for generations to come. So the question becomes, how do we shift our thinking from simply owning land to being responsible stewards of it?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And honestly, it feels a bit overwhelming. Where do we even begin? Well, it starts with recognizing that our individual actions have broader consequences. Think about it. If you own a house, you're not just responsible for what happens inside those four walls. Your property impacts your neighbors, the street, the whole neighborhood.
Right. I've definitely seen that firsthand. A beautifully maintained house with a blooming garden can inspire others to do the same, lifting the whole block. But on the flip side, a neglected property can drag down property values and make everyone feel less safe.
Exactly. So while we might technically own a piece of land, our decisions about that land impact a much wider circle.
It's almost like we're all sharing the responsibility whether we've realized it or not.
That's a great way to put it. And some of the legal tools we discussed in part one actually nudges us towards that mindset of shared responsibility. Take code enforcement, for example.
Hmm.
It's not just about punishing negligent owners. It's about reminding everyone that their property decisions impact the collective well-being of the community.
So if you let your property become a safety hazard or an eyesore, it's not just your problem, it's everyone's problem.
Right, and the same goes for vacant property registration. It's a way to encourage proactive maintenance and prevent those properties from becoming a burden on the entire neighborhood.
It's like saying, hey, we're all in this together, let's take care of our shared spaces.
Exactly. And that's where land banks can play a crucial role, too. They're not just acquiring properties, they're actively managing them with the long-term health of the community in mind. It's about recognizing the potential of these spaces and ensuring they contribute to the collective good.
I'm really starting to see the connection between these legal strategies and that bigger idea of stewardship. It's not just about fixing a problem, it's about fostering a sense of shared responsibility for the places we call home.
Absolutely. And it's not just happening on the legal front. There's a growing movement of grassroots initiatives that embody this idea of shared stewardship.
Oh, like what?
Well, community gardens are a great example.
Yeah.
Residents come together to transform vacant lots into vibrant spaces for growing food, connecting with neighbors, and beautifying the neighborhood.
I love that. It's a win-win for everyone involved.
Right. And there are also urban farms popping up in cities across the country, turning underutilized land into sources of fresh produce and community hubs. And then there are community land trusts where residents collectively own and manage land to ensure long-term affordability and community control.
These are such inspiring examples. It shows that people are realizing that land can be so much more than just square footage on a deed. It can be a canvas for creativity, a source of sustenance, a place for connection and belonging.
It's beautiful, isn't it? This rediscovery of the power and potential of land, and while legal frameworks and policies are essential, this shift in mindset is equally important.
I completely agree. But let's be real, shifting mindsets is a long-term game. It's not like we can just snap our fingers and suddenly everyone sees land as a shared responsibility. So what can we as individuals do to start embracing this idea in our daily lives?
That's a great question. It doesn't require grand gestures or sweeping policy changes. It starts small, it starts local, get to know your neighbors, talk about what you love about your neighborhood, what you wish was different.
So building those connections is a crucial first step.
Absolutely. It's about cultivating that sense of community ownership, that we're all in this together. Volunteer with a local group that's cleaning up a vacant lot, plant a tree. Support local businesses that are invested in the well-being of the neighborhood. Even small actions can ripple outward and inspire others to join in.
It's about showing up and demonstrating that we care about the land around us.
Exactly. And remember, the research paper we've been discussing is packed with even more information about specific legal reforms, case studies, and additional resources. You'll find a curated list of links in the show notes if you're eager to delve deeper.
Perfect, because I have a feeling our listeners are going to be fired up and ready to take action after this deep dive.
I hope so. And even if you don't live in a neighborhood with a visible problem of abandoned properties, the themes we're discussing are relevant everywhere: how we value land, how we care for it. These are questions we should all be asking.
It's about recognizing that we're all connected to the land, whether we realize it or not, and that connection comes with both responsibilities and incredible opportunities if we can shift our mindset, if we can start seeing land as a shared resource worthy of our care and attention.
Then we can unlock its potential to create thriving, vibrant communities for generations to come.
That's a beautiful vision. But before we get too carried away with our utopian dreams, we need to face a bit of a reality check.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, all these legal strategies sound great in theory, but we know that implementing them in the real world can be a whole different ballgame. There are going to be challenges, roadblocks, and unexpected hurdles along the way.
You're absolutely right. There are always going to be political battles, budget constraints, and pushback from those who benefit from the status quo.
So in part three, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of putting these legal tools into action. What are the potential pitfalls, the political battles, and the practical considerations that communities need to be aware of?
We'll explore those challenges and offer some insights from communities that have successfully navigated these complexities. It'll be a fascinating journey, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to our final part of this deep dive into vacant and abandoned properties. So we've talked about the problems, the causes, some potential solutions. But now let's get real about actually making those solutions happen out there in the real world.
Yeah, putting those ideas into practice can definitely be a whole other challenge.
So let's start with politics. I mean, I imagine that trying to pass any kind of significant reform, especially when it comes to property rights, is a tough battle.
It absolutely is. You've got property owners, developers, community groups, and of course politicians, all with their own agendas and priorities.
It's like a minefield of competing interests.
It can be. And then you also have the question of funding. A lot of these solutions require resources and a whole lot of political will to actually make them happen.
So how do communities even begin to navigate that political landscape?
Well, it starts with building coalitions, finding common ground among those different stakeholders, and really demonstrating that revitalizing these neglected properties isn't just about aesthetics or some kind of abstract community good. It's about tangible benefits for everyone involved.
Okay, so it's about making the case that everybody wins.
Exactly.
Safer neighborhoods, higher property values, a stronger tax base.
Right. It's about showing how addressing this issue can make the community better for everyone.
But I imagine that's often easier said than done.
It definitely takes effort. You need clear communication, solid data to back up your claims, and a strategy for addressing concerns head on.
So you need to be Part diplomat, part negotiator, part community
That's
organizer.
a wear a lot of hats.
Okay, so let's say you manage to get the political buy-in. What are some of the practical challenges that might come up when it comes to actually putting these solutions into action?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is simply the sheer scale of the problem. In some cities, you're talking about thousands upon thousands of abandoned
Well,
properties.
yeah.
It's a massive undertaking just to identify them all, figure out who owns them, and assess what can be done.
So it's not just about having the right laws.
No.
You also need the resources and the manpower to make it happen.
Exactly, and that's why prioritization is key. You have to focus your efforts on the properties that pose the greatest risk to public safety, or the ones that have the most potential for revitalization. And thankfully, technology can play a big role here. Cities are using databases mapping tools to track these properties, streamline processes, and make more data-driven decisions.
That's great. But even with the best technology, I imagine dealing with absentee owners can still be a nightmare.
Oh, it definitely can. You might be dealing with out-of-state landlords, shell corporations, heirs who inherited a property they never wanted and have no idea what to do with it.
It sounds like trying to untangle a giant knot.
It often is. And that's where those streamlined legal processes we talked about earlier become so important.
Like the tax foreclosure procedures, code enforcement, receivership.
Exactly. They give communities the tools they need to cut through that red tape and compel those owners to take action.
So it's about having the legal muscle to say, look, you can't just neglect this property. You have a responsibility to this community,
Right.
and we're going to hold you accountable.
Accountability is key. But it's not just about top-down enforcement either. Engaging the community is also essential.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Empowering residents to report problem properties, participate in planning processes, even take ownership through things like community land trusts can make a huge difference.
It's about shifting from a mindset of this is the city's problem
That-
to this is our community and we're all in this together.
Exactly.
I love that.
Because at the end of the day, these aren't just legal or logistical challenges. They're about people. They're about creating communities where everyone feels safe, connected, and proud of where they live.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the complexities of vacant and abandoned properties, the challenges of addressing them, and some of the inspiring ways that communities are fighting back and reclaiming these spaces.
It's been a really fascinating conversation.
What I found most encouraging is this idea of shifting our mindset. It's not just about fixing a problem, it's about recognizing that connection between land community and our shared future. Embracing our role as stewards and working together to create places where everyone can thrive.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, I encourage you to check out the show notes. We've included a bunch of resources if you want to delve deeper into this topic.
Yes, please do that. This is something that affects all of us,
Yeah.
and we can all be part of the solution.
Every little bit helps.
All right, so that wraps up our deep dive into vacant and abandoned properties. We hope you learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to take action in your own community.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making the world a little bit brighter.